Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Senior 3 IRE members, welcome to this lesson. We are going to be having IRE as per the timetable. I'm sure you have covered a number of topics in IRE before this lesson. Last time you were covering this topic with Sheikh Kaziba, and now I'm going to pick up from where he had stopped. We're going to be looking at section C, and as you all know, IRE has two papers, paper 1 and paper 2. With paper 1, we have already covered section A, where we have the life of the Prophet. We have already covered section B, where we have the Caliphate period, and now we are about to cover section C, where we have Islam in Uganda. As I told you and the chair told you, this has 8 major topics from which they pick 4 questions at the end of the day. The 8 major areas are: 1, the conditions in Uganda before the coming of Islam. Here we have the political, religious, as well as social, economic life of the people of Uganda before the introduction of Islam. Then 2, after looking at that, we assess and we look at how Islam addressed the above aspect, or what were the changes Islam brought into Uganda and Uganda after its coming. So that is topic number 1, which I'm sure you have all exhausted and covered. Then 2, we look at the actual coming of Islam. First we look at pre-Islamic Uganda, then we look at the coming of Islam. How when it came, we have to look at the people who brought it and the effects of the coming of Islam. Here we look at the factors that were responsible for the spread of Islam in Uganda and the challenges that these people faced on the spread of Islam in Uganda. I'm sure we have also covered that. Then topic number 3 is the reign of Mutesa. Mutesa 1, when he came into power, he did his utmost to make sure that he spreads Islam, and his reign is popularly known as the golden era in Islam. So here we look at the role played by Kabaka Mutesa, and that is topic number 3. Topic number 4 is where we are today, and it is called the political religious wars. These reign in a series of years between 1888 to around 1893. We are going to note that this war was not fought in a day, but rather it took a number of years. I'm told that you had already looked at the causes. When we are looking at this topic, majorly we look at the causes, we look at the cause, and we look at the effects. And maybe one other is why Muslims were defeated. So, as per the knowledge I have, Sheikh Kaziba had covered the causes and had covered the cause, or the organization. In other words, how were these people organized? How did they organize for the battle? That presupposes that we're going to be looking at the effects of the political religious wars, and then the factors or the reasons behind the Muslims' defeat in these wars. Briefly, you need to know that the religious wars in Uganda were the clashes between the Muslims and the combined parties of the Protestants and Catholics. In other words, there were 3 major parties in this crash. The 3 major parties included: number 1, the Muslims; Then the combined party, let me call them Christians, where we have the Protestants and the Catholics. And then we are going to be having the other party as the traditionalists, or the African traditional religion. As you may note, and you already know, that before the coming of Islam in Uganda, the region was dominated by the traditionalists, or the religion called the African traditional religion. One factor I want you to note is that these people at that time, Uganda had very few people. Because if today we are estimating that we have about 6 million people around Kampala, then think about 100 years back, how many people do you think were in Uganda and in Kampala in particular? The answer is easy, they were very few. So if at that time they had I'm estimating that we had about 100 people around the Kabaka's palace, then all of them subscribed to the African traditional religion. Then 1844, the Muslims come in. They started competing for the 100 people. Later on, the Christians come in, Catholics come in first. They're all competing for the 100 people. Later on, the Protestants come in. They are all still competing for the 100 people. You could find that a person who has been a traditionalist in the morning, in the afternoon is a Muslim, and in the evening is a Catholic, and later on turns to Protestant. Therefore, there was a fight for the converts. You are going to already note, because at that time there are few converts, but there are very many religions now, from one African tradition to 2 Muslim and 3 and later 4. But I can refer to this as Christians. So there had to be a crash, and that crash was witnessed in 1888 when the political religious wars began, because they were all fighting to get the few converts who were not increasing day after day. So there are very many causes, but among the causes is the fight for the few converts at the time. You already looked at the reasons. I'm not going to take much time onto that, because I know you had already covered that. So all had acquired guns, among other reasons, Mutesa's determination, and very many others. You already looked at that, and you already looked at the cause. My emphasis, or my topic of today, is going to be on the reason that at the end of the day, you all recognize that the Muslims were defeated and later on marginalized. However, today we're going to look at the reason. Before we look at the effects, we're going to look at the reason why the Muslims were defeated. The Muslims were defeated because of a number of reasons. The Muslims were defeated because of a number of reasons. Number one, the morale which the Muslims started with in 1888 was not the same at the end. At first, they began with a role, with the reduction and the morale. At first, when they had just started, they all wanted to protect their religion. They all were willing to go into a battle and make sure they fight for their religion. But after some time, because we are already noting that the battle did not take place in one day, but rather in very many years. So let's say they began in 1888 with a lot of morale. At the end, by the end of 1893, many of them were sent to different areas, and therefore their morale of fighting reduced, and this gave an upper hand to the Christians to take over, and that explains why the Muslims had to be defeated. Then number 2, the Christians received military aid as compared to the Muslims. The Christians received military aid as compared to the Muslims. By talking of aid, I'm talking about guns, and which was used for reinforcement. And remember, during that time, the missionaries, the Christians who came in for a mission of spreading their religion. Therefore, they had a backup of their country, home country, which had to give them a lot of aid. And among the aid they had to receive was fighting weapons, also called their guns. So the Muslims would hardly match them, and at the end of that day, the Muslims who had come as traders ending up fighting, after ending up losing the morale, and on receiving very little aid, especially militarily, they had to be defeated. So reason number 1 was the reduction in the morale of fighting, and number 2 was the Muslims were not receiving reinforcement aid, military aid in terms of guns, which the Christians was receiving. At the end of that day, the Muslims ended up being defeated. Number 3, the Muslims had sent a letter to their counterparts, to their helpers, the people of Zanzibar in Tanzania, and the letter landed into the hands of the colonial government, or the Lugard. And at the end of the day, whatever was sent had to be received, and received by Lugard, which was used against the Muslims, because Lugard could give them to the Christians who had to fight hard, and at the end of that day, they defeated the Muslims. Then, after a series of wars, the Muslims realized that they were not winning, and in 1890, let me call it 1890 incident. In 1890, they signed an agreement with the colonial government. Their leader, who was Nuhu Mbogo, signed an agreement with Captain Lugard, which forced the Muslims to surrender their weapons and accept Mwanga as their king. And on surrendering of their weapons, they could not fight anymore. And in 1993, the battle was no more, and the Muslims were defeated and completely marginalized. So the agreement which Nuhu Mbogo Prince signed with Lugard ended up forcing the Muslims to surrender their weapons, and further losing of their morale of fighting, and that ended up into the defeat of the Muslims. Then we all know that that was a time of scramble and partition. Scramble and partition. This was a time when the Europeans were running. We already note the word scramble. They were running, coming to rush and fight and get and gather more. So they were scrambling. They are running to take up, divide Africa into different parts. Where we have partition is dividing Africa into different parts. So this was a time of scramble and partition, where the Europeans had a lot of interest into Buganda and Uganda and Africa as general. They came in because that was a time of industrial development. There are very few. There are a lot of industries which are developed in Europe, and therefore they could not get where to sell their property. and they had to look out for different areas. So by coming in, they had to use all means possible to take control of these areas so they can easily sell off their products in Uganda and in Africa as a general. So that is why in 1880 the Europeans sent what they call Ibeco. You can also refer to it as Imperial East African Company, which came and facilitated the Christians to fought against the Muslims, ending up into the Muslims' defeat, and then the Europeans had to take control of the whole of Uganda, and by taking over the whole of Uganda, it meant the loss of the Muslims. So the role of Scramble and Ibeco Company contributed to the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. Then next was the missionary spread of the propaganda that the Muslims were planning to circumcise all the Uganda by force. And you can recall at that time in Uganda it was a taboo for very many people to be circumcised, not only to the Kabaka, but to some of the people, especially the chiefs. So the Christians came in with the propaganda that should the Muslims defeat the Christians, they will end up circumcising each and every person in the kingdom. What did this lead to? Very many Christians now had to fight with a lot of zeal and morale to make sure that they were not defeated to be circumcised. And you all know how difficult it would be for many of the members to be circumcised if they were not circumcised during their young days. And of course you all know that many of the people fear to be circumcised, and that is one of the reasons why we have few converts in Uganda, despite the fact that by 1844 Islam had already come onto the East African coast, and it had already penetrated into Uganda at around Kabaka Suna's court. The people had already received Islam by 1844. But how comes we have very few Muslim converts as compared to other counterparts? Because of some of the reasons, and notable among them is the fear to be circumcised. So when these Christians came out with the propaganda that should the Muslims win over the Christians, they will circumcise everybody by force. This made the Christians to join hands and fight with a lot of courage and zeal to make sure that they defeat the Muslims. And at the end of the day, by 1893, the Muslims had been defeated. Then another reason why the Muslims were defeated in the political religious war was the deaths of prominent Muslims, people like Batuma. This one was a morale booster of the Muslims, the Muslim mobilizer at the battle, and he created, when he died, it left the Muslim with a gap of no mobilization, and therefore Muslims started losing the energy of fighting. So the deaths of some prominent people, especially this Batuma, who was a drummer, who could drum, mobilize people as they were going into fight, who could drum and alert Muslims that there is an attack. When he died, it left Muslims somehow disorganized, and at the end of that day, it led to their defeat. Then Muslims lacked proper fighting tactics, inadequate I remember most of the Muslims who came in here were not trained to be army officials. They are not trained, number one. Two, they had inadequate fighting weapons. So look at a person who has been got from ashes to come in and fight, compared to the missionaries who had come from Europe with sophisticated fighting weapons and a bit of training because they knew what they had come for. Therefore, these inadequate fighting tactics coupled with the people who were fighting on the side of the Muslim could not help them win the battle. Because you all know, if you are not trained for warfare, you cannot go in for a competitive war and win. You can get a very good example. Preparations are always adequate and very good for the people who are to engage into the battle. If you are going to do any activity, you need to have prior preparation. Without prior preparation, you cannot win. So look at these Muslims who were, most of them were forced to go to embrace Islam by the king. Now they are coming in to fight on behalf of the Muslim, non-trained, and who could, again, no one could be there to train these people, since most of the Muslims had not come in for a mission of fighting, but most of them came in as traders and ended up spreading Islam. Now look at Islam needing people to come and defeat and fight for the religion. So inadequate fighting tactics coupled with fighting weapons led to the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. Remember, their counterparts had prepared and were experienced and trained by the colonial officers like Captain Rugard, who was a captain already, who could know and plan sophisticated moves against the Muslims, and therefore the Muslims, they had no way they could win in a serious encounter. So that is why partly the Muslims had to be defeated. Then next was, and I call it weakness phase of the Muslims. Most of the Muslims, on joining the fight, did not take a lot, did not make a research in fighting, because they expected Allah to grant them victory. Most of them had already learned about the battles the Muslims fought in the early days. For example, the Battle of Badr, where the inadequate Muslims 624 AD, where the inadequate the Muslims who were ill-equipped, who were very few, who were inexperienced, were helped by Allah to win over the Meccan. So when most of these Muslims did not fight with a lot of courage in anticipation that Allah will help them, just like He had helped the early Muslims in the early days. So most of them did not fight with a lot of zeal and courage, because they anticipated that they would be given victory by Allah. So this over-reliance on Allah and not putting in tactics and zeal to fight led to the Muslims' defeat in the battle, the political religious wars. So here we have number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, 8 factors as to why the Muslims were defeated in the political religious wars. Number 8 next. Number 9. The Christians, especially the colonial government, that was represented by Captain Lugard and the Ibeco, took control of Lake Victoria. Talking about Lake Victoria, because if the Muslim were to gain any reinforcement, it had to pass through Lake Victoria to be delivered into Uganda and Uganda. And therefore, the Muslims over-relied onto it. Remember, they sent a letter to the king of Zanzibar requesting for fighting weapons. However, all these vessels that were sent to help the Muslims was captured by Captain Rugard and the fighting weapons which he had delivered from Zanzibar, from other Muslim world, all had to be captured and were given to the Christian, and they were used to fight against them because they had taken control of Lake Victoria, which could deliver all the weapons. And at the end of the day, the Muslim jihadists had to be defeated. So, and one other reason why the Muslims had to be defeated was the action of the Christians of taking control of Lake Victoria, from which all the fighting weapons for reinforcement had to be passed to be given, handed over to the Muslims, but later it was only handed in to the Christians. Then, during the battle, Muslims lost a number of people, lost their commanders. Muslims lost their notable commanders, people like Kapalaga, Tebukoza, people like Muguluma, among others. This lowered their energy and morale. So at the beginning, we all know that they fought with a lot of zeal and morale, but after a series of years, the Muslims lost morale. One of the reasons that's why they had to lose their morale was the death of their notable commanders, the likes of Kapalaga, the likes of Tebukoza, Muguluma, Magadazi, among other people. And in so doing, the Muslims lost their energy of fight and morale. At the end of the day, the Muslims had to be defeated in the political religious wars. Then next was the death of Kalema. Nuhu Kalema, the Muslim leader, weakened their morale. He died in 1890 because of smallpox at Kijungute. We're going to see later on the Muslims died of smallpox. We're going to see that in the series of fighting, Muslims were pushed to different areas. Among other areas was a place called Kijungute. Kijungute was a place in Bunyoro where the Muslim refugees had to run to after their defeat in the political wars, religious wars. When they were defeated, they had to run to different areas. Some had to run to Ankole, others had to run to Bunyoro, others had to run to Busoga, and others had to run to Bunyoro, northern Uganda. And on running to Bunyoro, they settled in this place called Kijungute. So while in Kijungute, one of the Muslim leaders and the prince of the time and the king, Nuhu Kalema, died of smallpox. This reduced the morale of the Muslim fighters, lost their energy, and at the end of the day, Muslims had to be defeated. So the death of their prominent people, for instance, their leader, because of the smallpox, led to their death. However, we're going to see later on that because of their defeat in the effects, we're going to see that on running to different areas, it helped to strengthen Islam, because Islam had to spread it to different areas where these people had to run to. And today, when you go to these areas where the Muslims had to run to, we have concentration of Muslims in the areas where they settled. Areas of Ankole, areas of Bunyoro, areas of Busoga, among other areas. So the death of Nuhu Kalema led to the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. We said he died in 1890. Then also the distance. Can I call it distance of operation? Because after their defeat in the opening days, they had to run to different areas. We can see that some had to run to a place called Chijungu and Bunyoro, from where they had to plan to come back and attack people in Uganda. You can see that the distance was very wide, and it had to call for a lot of resources which were not there at that time. So this definitely frustrated the efforts of the Muslims. Then the colonial government disarmed the Muslims and their allies. So, for example, McDonald's, one of the colonial agents, disarmed the Sudanese soldiers who had shown readiness to support their fellow Muslims, instead armed the Christians. So look at disarming the Muslims and contrarily arming the Christians. At the end of the day, very many Muslims had to be killed, and this ended up into the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. So look at a scenario where you have people, they are ill-equipped, they don't have arms, and later signing an agreement on which they had to be disarmed. There was no way they would put up a formidable war, and at the end of the day, by 1893, the Muslims had been defeated in the political religious wars. MacDonald is one of the members who never wanted Muslims and who never wanted Islam to prosper. Then next, the Muslims were attacked mercilessly by diseases. So number 14 was the presence of we can already talk about smallpox, which claimed the life of Nuhu Kalima, who was the Muslim leader. Remember, in the first days, when the Muslims were defeated, they had to rush to different areas which had harsh living or harsh environment. For example, Chijungu, where they settled, and they ended up being attacked by a number of diseases, and they lacked medicine at the time. We all know why the Europeans did not want to come into Uganda at that time, or Uganda or Africa in particular, was because at that time Africa was still regarded as a darker continent, and at one time it was referred to as the area which claimed the life of the whites. Therefore, during that time they were attacked by a number of diseases, and recall that was the time when there was no cure of malaria at that time. At that time, there were a lot of forests in Uganda and Africa as a whole. Therefore, this gave out a lot of mosquitoes, resulting into other diseases like malaria, smallpox, among other diseases. So they claimed a number of lives, especially to the Muslims who had to run to different areas, and this had to lead to the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. Then next was some Muslims deserted. Some Muslims deserted Islam. In fact, not some, many of the Muslims deserted Islam after the deaths of Kabaka Mutesa and Kabaka Kalema, among others. Because you recall, at that time when the king said a word, it was a law. Therefore, when Mutesa came in, remember, during Mutesa's time was the golden era of Islam, how he had to force almost all his chiefs to convert to Islam. He had to give Jewish positions to the Muslims who embraced Islam. And by doing so, very many people embraced Islam, but they were not wholeheartedly. What happened in the events that followed? When Mutesa died, very many people deserted and left to go back to their previous religions, especially African traditional religion, and others ended up into joining the missionaries, becoming Christians, becoming Protestants, and deserting or moving away from Islam. So this was a menace how when they deserted Islam, Islam was left with a few people to fight for it, and those who would fight were those who were wholeheartedly believing into Islam. So the Muslims, most of them deserted Islam. In the course, these had not accepted Islam wholeheartedly. They were forced by Mutesa to join Islam. This was enough to explain the dangers ahead of the Muslims, and at the end of the day, when they went into the battlefield, they had to be defeated. So among other reasons, we have the Christians took control of Lake Victoria, the Muslims lost their commanders, especially Batuma, the drumsman, among others. The days of Kabaka Nuhu Kalema, the distance from which the Muslims were operating, disarming of the Muslims, presence of the diseases, deserting of Muslims, among other factors, led to the defeat of the Muslims. So as I wrap up, I'm looking at other reasons why the Muslims were defeated in the political religious wars. Another one, number 16, was the presence of hypocrites. Presence of hypocrites among the Muslims. And within the Muslims, there were people who were not faithful, and they turned up to be hypocrites, moving the info plans of the Muslims and uttering them out to the Christians. For example, in 1893, Prince Semakutu informed General Kakungulu of the Muslims' plan to attack Muanga and the Christians at Lubaga. Therefore, by the time the Muslims attacked Lubaga, they found one of the they were already waiting for. So instead of moving by surprise, the Muslims were rather the people who were surprised when actually they thought that they are going to surprise the Christians. So the presence of hypocrites among the Muslims, for example, Prince Semakutu, led to the defeat of the Muslims in the political religious wars. Then next was Muslims were divided over the strategies of winning or attacking the Christians. Mixed reaction. About the strategies. About the strategies of attack. They had mixed strategies, how some were preferring to peaceful means and they surrendered. Others were in for violent and attack of the Christians. So because they had a mixed reaction, they did not agree on which strategy they had to use to attack the Christians. Whereas some of them wanted peaceful means, for example, Taibu Magato and Mberege among and Sakibu, all these wanted peaceful means. However, others said that no, for us we must attack these people. They are armed, we cannot attack them peacefully. Therefore, most of these people had to surrender into, and they did not agree with the Muslims on the mode of attack. This weakened the Muslim force, which was already weakened, and leading to the Muslims' defeat. Then lastly, Muslims had fought many battles which exhausted their resources. Resources here we mean food, among other items of fighting, guns among others, and in so doing they could not win over the battle, and at the end of the day they were defeated by the Muslims. So while at home, please, I'm giving you an assignment about the political religious wars which you could try out, and when time avails you may send it. We shall look at our strategies of how to receive it, but please, in your own time, I'm giving out 2 questions, revision questions. Try them while at home, and make sure you make enough research, add on to the points we have not given out, and I'll be asking them at an appropriate time. Question number 1 is, what were the causes and effects? What were the causes and effects of the political religious wars? What were the causes and effects of the political religious wars in Uganda? Between 1888 to 1893. So please try out this question at an appropriate time. I'll be asking for the answers. Then question number 2. While at home, try out, please. Explain the factors that led to the Muslims' flight to Kijungute. Explain the factors that led to the Muslims' flight to Kijungute. Then part B. So, at home, please try out these questions. Number 1, what were the causes and effects of the political religious wars in Uganda between 1888 to 1893? And 2, explain the factors that led to the Muslims' flight to Kijungute. And part B, what were the effects of this flight? So we have already talked about Kijungute. In our discussion, we said that is a place where the Muslims had to run to after being defeated. Kijungute is a place located in Bunyoro. So look at the reason as to why the Muslims had to run and go to that area. So lastly for today, we are going to look at the effects of the political religious wars. We're going to use very few minutes to look at the effects of the Muslim, of the political religious wars. In other words, what was the outcome? When we talk about effects, we are talking about result. We are talking about consequences. We are talking about outcome. We are talking about importance, among others. Landmark, among others. So we're looking at what was the outcome. Here we all know if it could be positive and could be negative. So we are looking at the results of the political religious wars. I'm sure by now many of you could give almost all of them, but in the last few minutes we are going to briefly look at what was the outcome of the political religious wars. There are very many. Among others, we are going to look at the Muslims who are defeated, forcing them to go into exile to areas like Kijungute, we have already noted. Others went to Busoga, others went to Ankole, we ended up to Toro, others went as far as TZ, Tanganyika. Many of them even never came back. We already know that when you go to Ankole, you are going to find a section of Baganda, Banyankole, Baganda people with Baganda names, but speaking Runyankole. Live example could be the Mutasa people, among others. So all these, their grandfathers left because of the political religious wars after being defeated, and if you are to be killed, they ended up running to different areas, among others areas of Kijungute and Bunyoro, among other areas. So that was one of the outcomes of the political religious wars. Number two, the scourge of smallpox spread as a result of unhygienic conditions created by the wars, which created very many problems. Among the problems was the death of our king Kalema, who died in Kijungute because of smallpox. So one other effect of the political religious wars was the scourge or the development of a number of diseases, for example smallpox and spread of diseases like malaria, among others. Then many Muslims lost their lives with great men such as Muguluma, the commander. Tibukuza was one of the Muslim commanders. Lubanga, Kaparaga, Magandazi perished at the battle front. Others died because of starvation, and others died because of diseases. So one other effect of the political religious wars was the loss of lives. Of course, we all know that when there is a calamity and when there is a battle, there are a number. One of the reasons that cannot miss out is the loss of lives. Then next, and you all know that when there is a battle, there are a lot of other scourge diseases that may come out because of the death of the people who are not buried. They end up bringing in a number of diseases. It becomes unhygienic. All the place becomes unhygienic. So it leads to the giving out of a number of other diseases. Then the wars led to the signing of the 1890 incident between Nuhu Mbogo and Captain Lugard. So it led out to the signing of an agreement between Mbogo and Lugard, in which all the Muslims were disarmed, and the agreement further made Muslims move away from positions of power. And most of them who were, remember, during Mutesa's time, they occupied all the important positions in the government. But later on, the Muslims had now to lose their former political position. That is why we saw very many of the Muslims who are not embraced wholeheartedly, ended up into living out the faith, deserting Islam and going back to their former religion. So led to the signing of the agreement of 1890 between Nuhu Mbogo and Captain Rugard in Uganda. Then later on, after the war, the defeated Muslims were forced by the British to go and settle in the poorest areas of the kingdom, and the Muslims' land was divided basing on religious lines, and the Muslims were forced into the poorest areas. They were first given 3. These were Busuju, Gomba, and Butambala, but later on, when the Muslims complained that 2 were taken off from them, and they were left with only Butambala, which was dry and uncultivatable. It is just of recent that people have discovered the planting of Ntangawuzi and Mairuni, but at that time they were not growing anything, and that is why it also had a positive impact into it, because now Muslims resorted to trade, and that is why I may say it was not accident. It is not accidental that you find most of the Muslims driving taxis and traders and attending to butcher, because at that time they could not sell anything to go and educate their children. Then later on, one of the other effects led to the destruction of property. You all know that you throw out one spear, it is a property already lost. Therefore, that presupposes that when they went into fighting, a number of property had to be lost. For example, Muslim homes, gardens, and livestock were given a steep monthly treatment, and almost everybody had to lose property. Then Muslims became a poverty-stricken class in Uganda, as they had lost property and homes. They are now living like destitutes in their homeland. They became hawkers of firewood and drawers of water to survive. So most of them, because their property was confiscated, many of them were sent to different areas to settle in new areas in which they were not used to. They ended up to be very marginalized, and a position went ahead. Even up today, you can look at the effect of the political wars among the Muslims. The wars ended in the Muslim state of Uganda, of Dar es Salaam. Remember, at first when they were going in to fight, they said we are going in for Dar es Salaam, meaning we must put up a state of Islam. So Dar means state, Salam means state of Islam. So the Muslim at first during Mtesa's time, they had started up that phenomena, but when Mtesa died and after the political religious wars, it gave a death blow to the Muslim community in Uganda and Uganda in particular. Next, Islam was now described as a religion of the defeated minority. Then one of the other effects was the Muslims were ranked the third-class citizens in Uganda. Then the Christian parties, together with the colonial masters, visualized Islam as a source of immorality. Up to present, you can tell whatever happens, it is all attached onto the Muslims, whether it was done by them or not. Then the religious wars widened the relationship, or the gap, created a gap between the Muslims and the Christians in Uganda, as they had killed each other in the course of the fighting. So it created a gap which is yet to be closed. Even up to present, when you look at those strong Chibaganda, Christian and Muslim, there is a wide gap between the two. But this was brought up because of the political religious wars after the fighting and killing of the different people. Many Muslims were separated from their relatives as they had to be sent into exile. For example, some of the Muslims we said went to Bunyoro, others went to Soga, others went to Nkole, others went as far as Toro, others went as far as Tanzania, and some went as far as Congo. Most of them did not return to Uganda after the political religious wars. Even when the wars were ended, some of these people never returned to their homeland. Therefore, it was an effect and a disastrous effect onto the Muslims. Whereas later on, we shall see that it had some positive contribution, because whenever they went and settled, they ended up spreading Islam to the people they interacted with, thereby helping into the spread of Islam to other regions beyond Uganda. Our next topic will be the spread of Islam to other areas. So we're going to see that after the defeat, many of them had to go to different areas. Some went to Bunyoro, Toro, and wherever they settled, they ended up interacting with the people, ending up spreading Islam to these areas. Due to the wars, a true Muslim king sat on the throne of Uganda, and it was a taboo for the king to get circumcised, but no Karema broke this tradition and nothing happened to him. However, it was on a sad note that in 1890 he died of smallpox in Bunyoro. Then next, after the war, Uganda was fully placed into the hands of the Christians who became administrators and controllers of the realm. The whole state was Christianized. This is the scenario up to the present. Many Muslims were separated from their relatives. Okay, we have talked about that. Then the wars made Muslims of Uganda to develop a spirit of jihad. Then the wars separated the true Muslim from pretenders, because at first we had those who had officially embraced Islam, but when they went into fighting, some had to desert. So it separated the Muslims from the pretenders to be Muslims. Then the war resulted into the creation of Muslim villages, which are still being respected. These include Kijungu in Bunyoro and Butambala, which is located in Butambala district in Uganda. So I've left out a number of questions. Please try them out, and at an appropriate time I'll be asking for those questions. The questions, I repeat: one was explain the causes and effects of the political religious wars in Uganda. Number 2A, explain the factors that led to the Muslim flight to Kijungu. And part B, what were the effects of this flight? Thank you very much for listening to me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wish you good. Number 2A, explain the factors that led to the Muslim flight to Kijungu. And part B, what were